Hello, Quiet Rioters. It's me, Naomi. I was very sorry to miss you at the weekend for the Sunday school episode, so I thought I would jump onto a mini show to say hello. Hello. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to go foreign affairs, the US presidential race, the horrific ongoing tension in the Middle East means that I think too little attention until this week had been given to Ukraine in recent months. But it is, of course, suddenly back in the headlines. We've seen the delivery of F-16s to support the Ukraine air effort. We've seen incursions by Ukraine forces into border regions of Russia. So for those that haven't been keeping up with it, Ukrainian troops launched a surprise attack on the Kursk Oblast last week and advanced, we think, about 18 miles into Russian territory. And then yesterday, they made it into an area called Belgorod. Russia has now evacuated that area, all due to nearby Ukrainian activity. But we are now 2.5 years into the invasion, and frankly, I am deeply frustrated. While the West seems to agree that Putin should fail, there seems to be no agreed plan for how Ukraine should win. So I needed a therapist. I needed someone to talk me through it all, lower my frustration levels, give me some hope. And so I'm joined by friend of the show, former diplomat, current writer, current podcaster. It is, of course, Arthur Snell. Hello, Arthur.
Hello, Naomi.
Before we get into it, give our listeners some detail about your excellent podcast, Behind the Lines, and why they should all, like me, subscribe.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity. Behind the Lines is a podcast focused on foreign affairs. And what I try to do is delve into the areas that some of the sort of bigger podcasts aren't really touching on. So a couple of weeks ago, we did something on the Caucasus region. I've had episodes on this sort of battle that's unfolding within Islam between Muslims in Southeast Asia, notably Indonesia, and the Gulf region, and the sort of battle for control of global Islam. So things like that, which are really important and interesting, but not necessarily at the top of the headlines.
I agree. It is a brilliant podcast. And having listened to your edition on the Caucasus, I then got into a wiki trap looking at the ethnic plurality within the Caucasus. And
Which
it
is
is incredible. It is amazing. I had no idea whatsoever. You know, I thought it was kind of Armenian and Azerbaijani. And no, there's about 50 very distinct ethnic groups. And no wonder it has been such a hotbed for tension over the years. So listen to the show, subscribe to him, and then delve deep into that wiki trap as I did. You will not regret it. It will be an afternoon well wasted. Arthur, let's go on. Of course, I do mostly want to pick your brains on the West's response to the war. But before we get onto that, let's do a quick stock take of the current situation, these recent incursions into Russian territory. Now, look, it is war. Ukraine doesn't publish its strategy, of course. But what do you think we might be able to assume from these incursions?
Let's start with the impact it has sort of emotionally and intellectually, both for Russians and for Ukrainians. So Russia has not been invaded since World War II. Russia is obviously a great power. It's the world's largest country. All that goes without saying. So the fact that this country has now been invaded is a big deal. And however much Putin will try to spin this and point the finger at generals, and maybe some people will be sacked to pour encourager les autres, there is a basic fact that this is a very humiliating for Russia. And then also Kursk itself, as lots of sort of history buffs will know, was the site of one of its huge battles, a huge Russian victory against Germany in World War II. But it's also, and I think this is very significant, Kursk was the name of a nuclear submarine that sank with all hands in the year 2000 when Putin was a new president. And it was the first real crisis of his presidency. And some of you might recall that both, actually it was Britain and Norway, had some expertise in rescues from submarines, and the Russians refused. Putin refused to let that happen. And no doubt, that contributed to the deaths of of those poor sailors. So Kursk is a sort of trigger word, and I think we can't overestimate the importance of that. Now let's think of it from the Ukrainian side. Ukraine has been on the back foot, as everybody knows. They've been losing territory in the Donbass region. And I think basically, if you're Ukrainian, it's been rather depressing to experience this war for the last 6 months, at least, possibly a year. And now it's different. Now they can see their soldiers advancing, and they can see that they are once again defeating Russian military in the field. So I think the example of what it means for both countries is very important. Whether it means something strategically on the ground is much harder to say.
Well, indeed. I mean, I've heard all sorts of theories. I've heard, it's to divert the Russians away from the Donbass and have to put, forces up to the Kursk Oblast region of the border with Ukraine. I've heard it's about strategic energy infrastructure in the Kursk region that the Ukrainians might want to get hold of so that they can do a deal to get back their nuclear plant that Russia seized elsewhere.
Yes.
Is any of that likely to be true?
I think all of it has plausibility, and of course we're in the realms of speculation. But yes, if Ukraine could hold a chunk of territory, and they now claim they've got 1,000 square kilometers. Now we don't know if that's true. That's what their own generals are saying. Then it's a bridgehead. It's something that might be tradable in the future. And yes, Kursk, there's a big nuclear power plant there, and you've got the Russians holding and on several occasions damaging the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is inside Ukrainian territory. So is there a trade to be done there? So that might be one of the objectives. And the thing about drawing troops away from the Donbass where Russia is advancing, that doesn't yet seem to have happened. The Russians continue to advance, and the Ukrainians are expecting to lose 3 towns down there, which is just sort of south of Bakhmut, where, of course, famously the Russians eventually took the town. But when the Russians take towns, as we know, that they destroy them and then drive into the rubble. So it's not... they're not gaining populations or settlements. They're just using this incredibly destructive form of warfare. So I think a lot of this is about reminding the Russians that they can't afford to leave elements of their border unprotected, because they're basically where this advance has happened, which is fairly far north on Ukraine's border with Russia. The Russians weren't really guarding the border, and they'd probably assumed they didn't need to. Well, now they must be frantically looking at this huge border they have with Ukraine.
And it is enormous.
Yeah, and thinking of all the places where it might be vulnerable. And that in itself, of course, forces them to spread themselves more thinly.
And what do we know about the reaction in Russia so far? Let's break it down into 2 parts.
Yeah.
We'll start with the Kremlin reaction.
Yeah.
Presumably, Putin just will not stand for this kind of humiliation and will retaliate hard.
I think we have to accept that. And of course, the retaliation might take the form of terrible airstrikes on Ukrainian civilian populations or other types of reprisal. In terms of what he's done internally, there was televised one of these sort of conferences where Putin looks rather scary and talks to his governors and generals. And the governor of the Kursk region started to talk about the numbers of settlements that were now under Ukrainian control. And Putin basically cut him off. And I thought that was rather revealing. Putin clearly can't deal with the reality, or he certainly doesn't want his population to deal with the reality. And yes, will some generals be sacked? One of the challenges is that Putin sacked the generals further down the chain running the Ukraine war. So the person running the Ukraine war now is the head of the army, Gerasimov, and he's been in place for more than a decade. So I think sacking him would be a very big deal. So it's hard to know whether he'd go that far.
Well, you touched on this. You said that Putin didn't want the people to get the full information about this. The Russian people, I mean, I see a lot of very lazy commentary about Russia's economy doing well, but that is presumably largely because they are spending on a war footing. This is a war economy. So are Russians, we know, getting increasingly concerned about casualties, about costs, about impact on standard of living?
It's a tough one. I think, obviously, Russia has the great advantage that it can carry on selling its oil and gas to those countries that don't really care very much. And particularly, China and India continue to be very large consumers of Russia's energy exports. And actually, we have to be brutally honest about this, a lot of it is being laundered probably into European markets. And there's a big story to be told about this so-called shadow fleet. So Russia's economy ticks along. It's clearly they're spending, as you rightly said, a huge amount on the war. I think the other thing is scale. Just having this almost unbelievably large country means that you could be in Moscow or other cities and you think of Kursk as, yes, of course, you don't like the idea of the Ukrainians invading, but it certainly doesn't feel like it's on your doorstep. Having said all of that, we know that more than 130,000 people have been displaced by this Ukrainian incursion just in the last week or so. So I don't see how that can happen in any country without it having ripple effects into the wider population.
Quiet Riot. And what do we know about the arrival of these F-16s in the region? Could they help change the game for Ukraine? My question is, as I understand it, largely the Ukrainians have been flying and knowing how to operate with Eastern European aircraft. Are they even going to know how to operate and maintain Western F-16s?
Well, the fact that it's taken this long for them to arrive is partly because there's been quite a detailed training package and in fact delivered mostly by European operators of the F-16. So these are obviously American planes, but they're operated by several European countries, not by the UK. So that's one area we just haven't been involved. We always had a different set of aircraft. They've arrived. The numbers are still pretty small. But they're a very capable plane, and it's a plane that clearly gives Ukraine a bit more of an ability to not dominate the sky, but at least contest the sky. But in terms of, in comparison to Russia's Air Force, it's still a sort of minuscule pinprick. So it's not a game changer at all, but I think it reduces Russia's dominance, which up till now has arguably been a game changer for Russia in the sort of the air war.
Thank you. That is helpful because I saw a lot of headlines. Oh, the F-16s have arrived, almost as if, well, that's it now.
Yeah.
Great, they've got what they need and on to victory. These planes came from the West. So let's get back to the West's response.
Yeah.
My own view is that Putin is a monster. And if successful, he will not stop at Ukraine. I believe he wants to resurrect Imperial Russia. And of course, I understand the worries about escalation, but he is a bully. And I think he uses that fear to aid his advance. So I can't understand why our response feels so insipid. So, Arthur, reassure me, do they have a plan to help Ukraine win? Or are they just trying to slow down Putin's advance by drip feeding Ukraine with military supplies?
The reassurance, a lot hangs on the US election. And obviously, a few weeks ago, I think most people had slightly given up on the prospect of Joe Biden beating Donald Trump, and it looked very, very miserable. Now that you've got a completely different energy around the Democrat ticket in the US, the thought that Trump wins, clearly it's in the balance, but it's certainly not in the bag. America is still a huge element of Ukraine's ability to stay in the war, let alone win it. But I think that we have to go a bit deeper than that. Without America, Ukraine's in serious trouble. And that says something about Europe. And of course, you and I are both passionate Europeans, but bluntly, Europe hasn't reflected its extraordinary economic strength in its ability to defend itself. And that's a question which will need to be resolved over the coming years and decades. But for the moment, America's still clearly a key player. But it is also the case, and it has been the case, that America's approach to Ukraine has been extremely cautious. So historically, we think of America being quite gung-ho in these things and always wanting to sort of push Russia back and give its allies the support it needs. But actually in the Ukraine war, America has been the one has needed persuading on things like battle tanks, the F-16s themselves. It was a huge job. Although it's an American plane, it was the Europeans who wanted to give them. There are people who look at this and see Joe Biden and particularly his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, as people who they don't necessarily want Ukraine to win. They want Russia to be tied down. And of course, you could see why that might work for America, that it's a huge humiliation and defeat for Russia is quite complicated. But Russia tied down in Ukraine is convenient. It means it can't cause trouble in other places, possibly. Now, I think what we're seeing with this new incursion is very interesting, because it's the sort of thing that about a year ago, I think you might have had noises coming out of Washington. Oh, well, we're not sure this is a very good idea. Comments that it was incautious or risking
Or
escalation. We
breaking
haven't
one of Putin's red lines.
exactly. And the idea, and I think it's worth listeners hearing this straight. The idea that the Americans didn't know is just not going to be the case.
About this week's incursions.
Yes. Because the Americans will have been helping the Ukrainians in the planning, in the targeting, all kinds of things like that. Now, they might not have known perhaps the minute that the troops would roll across the border. That I'm sure there are elements of it that Ukrainians keep to themselves. But I suspect that within small groups in Ukraine's key allies, and of course UK included with that, there will have been some knowledge of this, very tightly held. So I think that suggests that there is possibly a more kind of rational understanding that Ukraine has to push Russia a lot harder. And yes, the fear of escalation is completely valid, and we must never dismiss it. But equally, if you don't escalate, then you make it easier for Russia to win.
And the Battle of the Black Sea, if we remember that, Ukraine sank so much of Putin's fleet that he withdrew the rest of it from Crimea.
Yes.
Which to me sort of proves that Putin's red lines are a bit overstated. Now, we never know which one is the real red line and which ones aren't. But I agree with you. The softly approach by comparison is essentially, to me, giving in to him. But the West isn't homogenous when it comes to Ukraine. You sort of said that it's the US that has needed pushing. But Germany is reported to be halving its military aid to Ukraine from 8 billion to 4 billion euros a year. Europe is much closer to Russia than the USA.
Yeah.
Can you sort of, it's really taking it back to basics for us, but as somebody who has observed Russia for a long time, remind our listeners why it matters so much that he doesn't win in Ukraine for us in the West.
I think basically that anyone, and you hear very well qualified, smart people say this, but anyone who suggests that all Putin wants is, and then insert the current war that he's fighting, is just delusional. What we've seen is a constant desire to expand into Russia's frontiers and of course sovereign countries on its frontiers, and to weaken Europe. So obviously we've got Ukraine, but let's not forget that a lot of Georgia, which is another European country, a country that wants to join the EU, a lot of Georgia is under Russian occupation. You have Russian military forces in Moldova, which of course borders Romania. Again, a sort of potential flashpoint. So the idea that, let's say that Russia, maybe it doesn't take the entirety of Ukraine. I think that objective has definitely failed, but it manages to hold on to the Crimea and hold on to the Donbass region. And that's, we're talking a huge area of territory. And those people who say, well, that would be okay, it's worth it for peace. Well, who thinks they're stopping there? Let's then think about the Baltic states, which of course were under occupation, absorbed into the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Those countries are terrified of the prospect of Russia rolling back in there. So I think we absolutely, we can't let Putin understand that the reward for invading a country is that you get to keep part of that country, or perhaps all of that country. And the threat to Europe, and this goes back to the thing I was saying earlier about the sort of the future decades. Europe hasn't been serious about its defense. And of course, Europe isn't united. Hungary is on Russia's side. There are elements in many European countries, including possibly our own. We've seen Nigel Farage defend Putin. He's then rolled back because actually the British public really, really don't like the Russians. But those countries that are closer to Russia and perhaps feel more threatened, there's always been an element of populations that see that side and are willing to support that type of politics. Hungary, Slovakia, you see it in Italy, not with Giorgia Meloni, but others on the Italian right. Marine Le Pen could well be a president of France within a couple of years. She's got a long history of letting Russia get away with things and taking their money and so on. So I think Europe is very vulnerable and has yet to grapple with the question of its own defense in a world where America is moving on. And that's something which whoever's in power in America, their commitment to defending Europe can only drop over the coming decades. Whether, Trump, it's a disaster, but even with a President Kamala Harris, she's got to think about the Pacific, about China, about all those other issues.
I don't know that you've reassured me, Arthur, but
I'm
thank you.
sorry.
I don't know that I'm feeling any more buoyant than I was before. Listen, briefly, while I've got you,
Yes.
we're going to take a look at the Middle East as well. Not for once Palestine and Israel, which deserves its own show.
Yeah.
But I have seen reports this week from Northern Syria that Islamic State, or ISIS, is resurgent again.
Yeah.
And while I had you, I just wanted to take your pulse on how concerning that is, or whether it's a storm in a teacup.
I certainly think it's something that people can't be complacent about. Well, what's happened there is, as people will recall, you had this Kurdish Syrian group, the YPG, which was in alliance with Western forces, but in particular America, and they basically took the fight to Islamic State, and we owe them the extraordinary gratitude required of having defeated them. And then the world lost interest. You have these huge camps being run by these Kurdish groups full of ISIS prisoners. And of course, people know the story of Shamima Begum, but there are many, many thousands there. And people really aren't giving the resources needed to secure these camps. And that area remains contested. It's not under the control of President Assad, obviously the dictator who's sort of destroyed Syria over the period of the civil war. The Kurds, they're not a sovereign state. They lack many resources, and they face the challenge that Turkey, and of course Turkey, a NATO member, a complicated ally of many Western countries, Turkey would rather that they didn't exist. And at times Turkish security agents have seemed to have sort of turned a blind eye to ISIS, which is, a rather terrifying prospect. It's a sort of bubbling situation which just doesn't go away.
Well, Arthur, thank you so much. I think that's probably all we've got time for today. And I certainly don't want to depress myself with the state of geopolitics for a minute longer. But thank you very, very much for joining us again and helping us get up to speed with everything that's been going on in Ukraine, especially. Listeners, make sure you're signed up to Arthur's brilliant show Behind the Lines. Do make sure that you're following Quiet Riot Pod on Blue Sky. We're trying to dial down on the old X/Twitter, but we'll be there for a while yet. And the main show will be back with Alex and I this week. Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll see you again very soon. And Arthur, thank you.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Naomi.
That's it for now. We'll see you again soon. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Andreou and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Singita. Artwork by Simona Canello. Quiet Riot is a co-production with SandStone Global. Yay!
Good.
Stop.